Everyone laughed when Leo left his fields half empty and drove in strange, crooked lines. They called him a fool, until a historic storm wiped out every farm in the county. While his neighbors faced total ruin, Leo's land remained untouched. How did he survive? The shocking answer lies in a forgotten secret. The mid-April sun beat down on the West Texas panhandle like a hammer. Out here the plains are completely flat, bone-dry. The air is always thick with a fine choking red dust that coats your teeth. The heavy, mechanical smell of expensive diesel hangs over the fields from sunrise to sunset. It was planting season. The most critical high-stakes time of the entire year. All across the county, massive $500,000 tractors crawled across the horizon. They were guided by satellites. They moved in perfect, laser-straight lines. Every single neighbor was planting fence to fence, squeezing every last cent out of the earth. In this business you do not waste a single inch of workable dirt. But Leo Vance was not driving a $1 million machine. And he certainly was not driving in a straight line. Leo sat in the dusty cab of a rusted, faded red 1990s Case IH tractor. The exhaust pipe rattled. The gears ground hard. But the engine hummed with a loud, paid-off rhythm. He gripped the steering wheel tightly. He pulled it hard to the left. Then he made a long, sweeping pull to the right. He was deliberately carving massive, bizarre, crooked curves directly through the center of his property. It looked like a terrible mistake. It looked like absolute madness. But it wasn't just the crooked driving that caught everyone's attention. It was the land he was leaving behind. Right in the middle of his valuable high-risk cash crops, Leo was leaving massive 30-foot wide strips of dirt completely untouched. He wasn't plowing them. He wasn't planting them. He was just letting the native buffalo grass grow wild and thick. To any modern farmer this was not just a mistake. It was financial suicide. The buffalo grass was deep-rooted, tangled, and tough. The neighbors just called it useless weeds. By leaving those massive strips unplowed, Leo was willingly throwing away 20% of his plantable land. Down on the shoulder of Highway 87, 3 veteran farmers stood leaning against the dusty tailgate of a pickup truck. They watched the red Case IH tractor drag its heavy plow in those strange looping patterns. Harlan Cole pushed his cap back, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He had worked this brutal land for 40 years. He knew the crushing cost of seed. He knew the crushing cost of diesel. What in the world is he doing? Harlan muttered, his eyes narrowed against the glaring sun. Beside him, Elias kicked at the dry, cracked dirt with his heavy boot. Looks like the boy forgot how to drive straight. The third man just shook his head. He let out a short, dry laugh. He has no idea what he's sitting on. That is prime acreage. His grandfather would have had that ground ripped and planted by sunrise. They watched Leo park the old Case IH near a rusted metal silo. They watched him climb down from the cab. He didn't look toward the highway. He didn't wave. He just walked quietly into the deep shadows of the barn. None of the men by the truck said it out loud. But they were all thinking the exact same thing. Leo Vance had returned from the city to take over a farm that was already drowning in debt. The pressure was massive. And now, at the very start of the most important season of his life, he was choosing to leave perfectly good ground unplowed. To them he had completely lost his mind. Why would a man fighting for his financial life willingly throw away his only chance at a profitable harvest? Was he making a fatal error that would cost him the entire farm? Or was he quietly building something the experts could not even see? Leo Vance was not doing this for fun. He was not a rebel trying to make a foolish point. He was fighting for his life. Just 6 months prior, Leo sat in a cold, glass-walled office in Dallas. He wore a crisp suit. He stared at glowing computer screens. He lived a safe, predictable life. But then the phone call came in the middle of the night. His grandfather had passed away suddenly. Leo packed his bags, drove the long highway back to the Panhandle, and walked into a quiet, empty farmhouse. The silence of the plains was deafening. His grandfather's old canvas jacket still hung on the iron hook by the door. His heavy work boots still sat by the mudroom step. But the grief was quickly swallowed by pure, suffocating panic. When Leo opened the heavy wooden desk drawer in the farm office, he found the terrifying truth. The family farm was drowning. Modern farming is a brutal, unforgiving machine. It does not care about family legacy. It demands massive amounts of cash just to survive. The stack of bills on the desk was a nightmare. There were invoices for skyrocketing diesel prices. There were past due notices for expensive chemical fertilizers. And at the very bottom of the pile lay a thick, heavy envelope from First AG Credit. The debt was massive. The bank was circling like a hungry hawk. A senior loan officer in a sharp suit had driven out to the farm in late February. He sat right at Leo's worn kitchen table. He tapped his expensive pen on the wood. The terms he laid out were cold, calculated, and final. Leo had exactly one season. One single harvest. If he could not produce a highly profitable crop by the end of the year, the bank would foreclose. The 800 acres of land his family had bled and sweat for would be auctioned off to the highest bidder. It would be swallowed up instantly by a corporate megafarm. The Vance legacy would be permanently wiped from the map. The psychological weight was crushing. Leo could not sleep. Night after night, he walked the creaking floorboards of the old house in the dark. He felt the eyes of his ancestors watching him from the framed photographs on the wall. He could not be the man who lost the land. He needed a miracle. But he could not afford the modern miracle of a $500,000 deep-water irrigation well. He was completely trapped, with the clock ticking relentlessly toward harvest. If you want to know what people are saying in a farming town, you go to the livestock auction barn. The diner attached to the barn smelled like stale black coffee, burnt bacon, and cattle manure. It was the absolute epicenter of local gossip. At 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, the diner was packed. The air was loud with the clinking of heavy ceramic mugs and the deep, rough voices of veteran farmers. In the center booth, holding court like a king, sat Harlan Cole. Harlan was not just a farmer. He was an empire builder. He ran a massive 5,000-acre megafarm. He drove a brand-new lifted truck. He believed deeply in maximum extraction. Harlan relied on massive deep well irrigation pumps that sucked thousands of gallons of water from the earth every single minute. He pumped the soil full of synthetic chemicals. To Harlan, the land was not a living thing. It was just a factory floor. And today Harlan was in a talking mood. "You boys see the Vance kid driving his tractor yesterday?" Harlan asked loudly. The booth erupted in deep laughter. "Looks like the city boy forgot how to steer a straight line," another veteran farmer chuckled, wiping his mouth. "It gets worse," Harlan said, leaning forward heavily on the table. "He is leaving 30-foot strips of weeds right in the middle of his field. He is just letting the native buffalo grass grow wild. He is intentionally throwing away 20% of his acreage." An older veteran shook his head in disgust. "In this business you plant every square inch. You have to just to pay the bank. That boy is an absolute fool." Harlan took a slow sip of his black coffee. "I give him until August. The bank will foreclose. We will be buying his rusted equipment at the auction block by the end of the summer." They laughed again. A harsh, dry, unforgiving sound. But they did not know Leo was sitting just 3 tables away. Leo sat perfectly still in the dim corner booth. He wore his grandfather's faded jacket. He heard every single word clearly over the diner noise. He felt the hot rush of humiliation rise in his chest. His hands gripped his coffee mug so tight his knuckles turned white. It takes a massive amount of discipline not to stand up and fight back. But Leo did not say a word. He did not argue. He did not walk over and try to explain his strategy. He just pulled a crumpled $5 bill from his pocket, left it on the table, and walked quietly out the door into the dusty morning wind. Let them laugh. He knew something they didn't. Flashback to the bitter, freezing months of winter. It was late January. Outside, the brutal panhandle wind was howling, rattling the thin glass windows of the farmhouse. Leo was up in the dark, freezing attic. He was sorting through heavy cardboard boxes of his grandfather's old belongings. The air was bitterly cold. His breath formed thick white clouds in the dark room. In the far back corner, hidden under a heavy canvas tarp, Leo found a small, reinforced wooden crate. Inside was a cracked, leather-bound ledger. The pages were yellowed, stiff, and fragile. The handwriting was sharp but faded by time. Leo shined his flashlight on the date written on the very first page, 1934. It was the absolute peak of the devastating American Dust Bowl. A time when the sky turned black with suffocating dirt, rain completely stopped falling, and thousands of desperate farmers lost absolutely everything. But as Leo carefully turned the fragile pages, reading the words of his great-grandfather, he realized something incredible. His great-grandfather had not just survived the nightmare of the Dust Bowl. He had thrived in it. And the secret to his survival was written right there in the ledger. It was a forgotten, abandoned agricultural technique called keyline plowing. The handwritten notes were clear, precise, and highly scientific. His great-grandfather explained the fatal flaw of modern farming. When a farmer plows perfectly straight rows, they create thousands of tiny, straight gutters across the landscape. When the rare, explosive flash floods finally arrive, the water hits those straight gutters, accelerates rapidly, and washes all the rich topsoil away. The water drains right off the land before it ever has a chance to soak in. The ledger offered a brilliant, counterintuitive alternative. Do not fight the land. Flow with it. By cutting deep, curved subsoil trenches along the natural contours of the earth, a farmer could instantly stop the rushing water. And by intentionally leaving wide strips of deep-rooted native buffalo grass, they could create a massive underground sponge. The science was simple but absolute genius. When the brutal, tearing panhandle winds blew, the tall native grass strips acted as a physical wall, stopping the wind from stripping the topsoil away. And when the rare, violent flash floods came, the curved trenches caught the rushing water. The deep, tangled roots of the buffalo grass pulled that heavy moisture deep into the subsoil, storing it safely underground for months. It was a perfect, self-sustaining system. It held the water. It locked down the dirt. It was scientifically proven survival wisdom. But it had been completely abandoned by modern farmers who demanded the speed and convenience of driving fast in perfectly straight lines. Leo sat in the freezing attic for hours. He read the ledger until his eyes burned in the cold. He slowly closed the heavy leather book. He made his decision right then and there. He would not farm the modern way. He would bet his entire inheritance, his grandfather's legacy, and his financial future on the forgotten wisdom of the men who worked the land before him. The warning came on a Tuesday morning. A sleek, silver sedan crunched up Leo's gravel driveway, carrying the local agronomist and the senior loan officer from First AG Credit. They stepped out into the heat, looking at Leo's fields with undisguised pity. "Leo, we've been looking at the aerial surveys," the loan officer said, his voice clipped and impatient. "You're idling 20% of your acreage. Those buffer strips aren't crops, they're just weeds sucking up nutrients. If you don't plow those under and plant full fence to fence, you won't meet the production targets for your loan covenants." The agronomist nodded. "And look at your soil moisture, son. It's bone dry. Take out a secondary loan for a deep water irrigation well. Use the neighbor's model. Force the water out of the aquifer, or you're going to be staring at a dust patch by July." Leo looked at the men, then at the vast, flat horizon. He saw the trap they were offering. More debt, more reliance on a drying aquifer, more of the same cycle that was killing his neighbor's profit margins. "I'm not digging a new well," Leo said, his voice quiet but rock solid. "And I'm not plowing the strips." The men left, convinced they were witnessing a slow-motion financial suicide. Leo ignored them. He worked in a fever state. For weeks he lived inside the cab of that old Case IH. He installed massive industrial-grade stadium lights on the tractor's frame, turning his nights into a blinding, surreal stage. He didn't just plow, he performed surgery on the land. He followed the exact contour maps his great-grandfather had sketched in 1934. He ripped deep, curved subsoil trenches, cutting miles of hidden arteries into the hardpan to create those vital water traps. It was grueling, soul-crushing labor. The vibration of the tractor rattled his teeth until his head throbbed. The isolation was absolute. He wasn't just fighting the dirt, he was fighting the doubt of the entire town. Every time he passed a neighbor's gate, he felt their judgment. He was betting his inheritance, his father's legacy, and his entire future on a dead man's notes. He was alone with the wind and the history he was trying to resurrect. June arrived with the force of a furnace door swinging open. The temperature didn't just climb, it surged. 100 degrees by noon. 105 by 2 o'clock. The big dry had settled over the panhandle like a physical weight. The air became so thin and hot that it felt like breathing through a wool blanket. The regional crisis was no longer a rumor, it was a catastrophe. The massive Ogallala aquifer, which fed every farm for 100 miles, was hitting record lows. One by one, the neighbors' multi-thousand-dollar irrigation pumps began to fail, sputtering nothing but thick, brown mud and air. Across the county, the expensive chemically fed corn and soy crops began to curl, turning a sickly, dehydrated yellow, then a brittle, ghost-like white. Then came the radio alert. Leo sat in his kitchen, his skin tight from the heat, when the weather radio crackled to life with a sharp, distorted urgency. A historic hubbub, a wall of dust and wind over a mile high, was tearing across the plains from the west. But it wasn't just the dust. The radar showed a massive, violent 4-inch flash flood storm front chasing the wind. It was the ultimate nightmare for any farmer. The wind would act like a giant vacuum, stripping the dehydrated topsoil right off the surface. And then, before the earth could stabilize, the rain would hammer down with enough force to drown the roots and create a concrete-like crust of silt. Leo stood on his porch. The silence before the storm was eerie. He looked at his fields. The rows were crooked, the strips of grass were tall and swaying, and he felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The stress test had arrived. By 3 p.m., the sky turned a color that didn't belong in nature, a bruised, toxic purple that bled into a deep, claustrophobic black. Then the world ended. The wind hit first. It wasn't just a breeze, it was a physical blow, a 70 miles per hour wall of air that sounded like a freight train screaming past his ears. The dust arrived with it, a blinding, suffocating cloud that blotted out the sun and turned the day into a hellish midnight. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Then came the roar of the rain. It didn't start with a sprinkle. It came in a torrential, violent deluge, a literal sheet of water that slammed the earth with enough kinetic energy to bruise the ground. Leo stood on the back porch, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. He was shouting into the storm, though he couldn't even hear his own voice. The noise was deafening, a chaotic, thundering symphony of wind and water. He was paralyzed by the raw, indifferent power of nature. There was no more work to be done. No more adjustments to be made. The tractor was parked, the gates were locked, and his fate was entirely in the hands of the decisions he had made months ago. His grandfather's ledger had promised that the keyline trenches would catch the surge and that the grass roots would hold the soil. But here in the howling, pitch-black dark, theory felt incredibly small. He waited for the sound of his topsoil washing away into the highway ditches. He waited for the roar of a total loss. All he could do was watch, listen, and pray that the man who wrote those notes in 1934 knew something the world had forgotten. The morning after the storm arrived with a terrifying, absolute silence. The sun rose over the West Texas panhandle, illuminating a landscape that looked like a war zone. Harlan Cole stepped out of his truck and stared at his 5,000-acre empire. It was gone. Because Harlan and his neighbors had planted in fence-to-fence, laser-straight lines, they had created the perfect environment for a disaster. There were no windbreaks, no buffers, and no contouring to slow the energy of the storm. The 70 miles per hour winds had acted like a giant scythe, stripping the dehydrated topsoil clean off the surface. And then the flood delivered the final blow. The compacted, perfectly flat soil of the modern farms had become hard as concrete. The rain didn't soak in, it didn't nourish the earth. Instead, it accelerated. It turned into a raging river of brown sludge that ripped through the fields, carrying away thousands of dollars worth of expensive seeds, synthetic fertilizers, and the very topsoil required to grow anything. The highway ditches were clogged with the remnants of their fortune. Millions of dollars in assets had been washed away in a single night. The scene was devastating. The once proud fields were now gullied, scarred, and lifeless. The veterans stood by their trucks, their boots caked in the mud of their own failure. There would be no harvest this year. The bank wouldn't just be calling them, they would be coming to take the keys. Their modern high-tech methods had hit the limit of their logic, and they had absolutely no backup plan. Leo Vance pulled on his muddy boots, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know what he would find when he walked the property line. He expected the worst. But as he crested the slight rise of his low field, he stopped dead in his tracks. The difference was staggering. The ground around his farm was clean. When the violent flash flood had hit, the water didn't rush away. It had struck the curved, keyline trenches Leo had carved into the earth. The energy of the water was broken immediately, forcing it to spread out gently across the landscape. The 30-foot strips of native buffalo grass had performed exactly as his great-grandfather's ledger promised. They had acted like a giant, organic anchor. The deep, massive root systems of the native grass held the topsoil firmly in place while the wind howled overhead. Meanwhile, the strips grabbed the floodwater and pulled it deep into the subsoil, creating a massive, living sponge. His cash crops were vibrant. They were standing tall, deeply watered, and completely untouched by the erosion that had claimed his neighbor's land. The drought had been broken on his farm because the earth had held on to every drop. The 90-year-old secret from the Dust Bowl hadn't just worked, it had saved his life. Leo walked through his rows, his boots sinking into soft, rich, damp earth. He looked at the lush green leaves, then up at the sun. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. A few days later, a familiar, shiny truck slowly crunched up Leo's gravel driveway. It was Harlan Cole. Harlan didn't speed in. He didn't look arrogant. He stepped out of his truck, his head hung low, and looked across Leo's lush, green field, a stark, impossible contrast to the wasteland of his own property. The veteran farmer didn't laugh. He didn't offer a joke. He swallowed his pride, a gesture that must have tasted like ash in his mouth. "I lost everything," Harlan said quietly. "How? How did you keep your dirt? How did you keep your crops?" Leo didn't gloat. He didn't point out the times Harlan had mocked him in the diner. He simply nodded, turned, and motioned for Harlan to follow him inside. He led the older man to the kitchen table and opened the cracked, leather-bound 1934 ledger. He showed him the diagrams. He explained the science of the curves and the roots. The moral of the story was quiet, but it rang through the house. Wisdom doesn't always come from the newest technology, the biggest machines, or the loudest voices in the room. Sometimes, the land remembers how to survive, if you are just humble enough to listen to the people who worked it before you. The cycle of debt and extraction was broken, not by more chemicals or more loans, but by going back to the roots. If you've ever been doubted by the experts or forced to prove yourself when the odds were stacked against you, hit that like button and subscribe. True wisdom survives the storm. See you next time.